Greetings, everybody. This is Christopher Messina coming at you from the Messy Time Studios, broadcasting as ever from the beautiful beaches of the last free state in America, Florida. This is the 10th of April, 2025. And joining me today from another beach a little further north is Damian Sciano, who is a experienced utility executive and a PhD of electrical engineering, who's here to, well, I'm not even gonna color it. Welcome to the show.
Awesome. Oh, I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Chris. And I guess I'm technically a utility engineer. Let's keep it at that. I don't think I was actually an executive.
Well, whatever. Yeah, so we want to make sure. So, which means for those who don't speak corporate, that Damian wasn't useless.
Appreciate that. But yeah, no. So my overall message would be, one, I'm super hopeful for the future. I think the energy industry and the electric industry in particular are the lifeblood of the country. I think there's nothing but options out there of how to do it right. And, honestly, we're building on decades and decades of mitigating carbon, and reducing it and making the grid cleaner. And we got to get off this carbon fixation, really is what I, want to say in this concept of net zero at all costs, and start doing some really smart things and being intellectually honest about what's working and what's not working, what's just, kind of signaling. And, and that's going to allow us to both, mitigate any climate issues there might be and also adapt to them, which is going to be critical too, because under no scenario is there's no status quo in the earth to begin with. And again, no matter where you are on the spectrum of climate denial or climate hysteria, no matter where you fall in between those two, there's no scenario where nothing changes, So that would be
I'd like to hear that, because this is a fresh approach for many Americans who only hear screaming, ranting, raving insanity from what I call the climate hysteria apocalypse carbon church. Because it has all the hallmarks of a religion without a lot of kind of examination of real data. And I will just give this quick comment. And curious about how you want to take this, but what I find so fascinating is since the 50s, human activity was going to cause global freezing. We're all going to freeze to death because of carbon. Then it was global warming. Then when the statistics didn't actually show that, they very subtly shifted to climate change, which is hard to argue with because the climate always changes. But no matter what, the political class's cure for freezing, heating, or volatility has always been somehow more taxes. Which arguably moving money around has nothing to do with the climate. So I'm curious from having seen inside the utility had to deal with the fallout from all sorts of laws, especially in a place like New York, which differ from other parts of the world. Kind of what are the biggest takeaways you've seen? What were the things that made a little sense? Those things that were insane? Those things that you would kill instantly? Just wide open. The floor is yours.
Yeah. It's almost. I think the demonizing of fossil fuel would be the thing I'd highlight as the biggest problem. And it's hard to fight against in places like New York State and California, where there's almost an over exuberance. Again, for this carbon-free world at all costs. I've been in meetings where literally they've said, well, you're a utility guy, and that's like a fossil fuel guy, and you are the same as a cigarette manufacturer. You've been lying to us for years and blah, blah, blah. And this almost frustratingly simplistic argument that because something's not perfect, we can't have any perspective on it. And if we could find a flaw with it and somewhere else on a piece of paper come up with what we believe would be a perfect world, well, then all of a sudden this is, demonized and this is what we're doing. And you see the fallout of dumb things happening in the policies. And I can highlight them. Indian Point was a 2,000 megawatt nuclear power plant, upstate New York. Shutting that down increased carbon pretty dramatically. I got the numbers right here, but it was on the order of 5 or 10% for the state, and as much money's been thrown at solar in particular in New York State, and wind is really in the back burner there because it hasn't happened. Nothing has overcome that one single move. So you tell me the world's going to end if we don't reduce climate, and then you shut down the largest carbon-free resource that you have. It's contradictory. And I get it. There's other people that are saying, well, there's other reasons we did that, and da, 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 da. But yeah,
Something of a fact-free zone, and that's part of the issue, is that the one major flaw in any democratic system can well be that 3 idiots rule 2 wise men. That can't happen, right? And so nothing's perfect. And if you had a qualifications test before you voted on things like this, maybe policy would be better. But then we get into the leadership of the technocrats, which could also go south.
Yeah. I mean, I'll try to be fair about it. I mean, I look at it like as a pendulum. There's both extremes are bad. Sticking your head in the sand is a problem, but also, just being, again, you and I are exhaling carbon dioxide right now. So the idea of a net zero human impact is already kind of anti-human and impossible. Yeah. And even though I get the broader context of it, it's just frustrating, and it's an oversimplification. And again, I know you and I are probably slightly different places. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. Yep. It retains heat. Okay. I've read the summaries, at least, of these IPCC reports, and that's the the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right? So those are the groups. When you hear about the consensus and all this, yeah. And the summaries get a little bit politicized even from the report itself, but it's not saying the world is going to end. It's not saying Superman's going to come and spin the world backwards and we're going to have no impact. It's just saying we're going to be somewhere between 1.5 degrees, which a bunch of politicians decided would be the ideal number, and it could be as high as 4 degrees. And quite frankly, 4.5 degrees came off the table. I bet you didn't even hear about that. That was in 2021.
But it was over 100-year period, right?
That was over 100+ year period. That's right. And
I have to share before I forget. Dennis Miller did this phenomenal bit on this back when it was still global warming, so maybe 25 years ago already. And he was quoting the IPCC report. As a comedian, he said, they told me the world's going to heat up 2 degrees. Well, I travel for work, right? I've traveled to here today, to Vegas. So last night as an experiment, I set the thermometer in my hotel room 2 degrees hotter. I don't know.
Right. And not making light of it, but that's the choices. And then that's where adaptation comes in too. There's 3 things you could do. Do nothing. You could try to mitigate climate change, which again, even the most zealous people aren't suggesting 0. They're suggesting 1.5, right? And then they're just saying that's better than 2, which is pretty light.
The true zealots are suggesting 0, but they're nuts. Yeah. Sandy Cortez, who knows nothing, she says 0 because it sounds great. Rational people aren't saying 0.
Right. Even the irrational ones are saying 0 carbon. And if maybe they don't realize it, but it's still going to be 1.5 degrees from the 1849 benchmark or whatever point they took.
Which is a solid baseline, I'm sure.
It does feel like it was chosen.
1849.
It does feel like it was literally chosen, but that's it. I'm not a climate scientist. This is already, I'm going to be criticized because I'm akin to a cigarette manufacturer that's been lying to people. But, we pride ourselves on providing electricity, and the context that I'm just saying is a perfect no. Can you cite some pollution? Can you cite some asthma? There's some cause and effect, but life expectancy has.
One of the best things we did was
the
Clean Air Act, which took out stocks and all sorts of stuff out of the environment and reduced the acidification in upstate lakes and Appalachia, and Adirondacks. All that's great.
Yes.
Right. So there's nothing wrong with cleaner air and regulation on. It's what just sticks in my craw, just because I deal with these lunatics so much. Is this madness about carbon? Because I'm 18% carbon. I think it's the best 18% of me. But anyway, so what I'm curious about is, what you being in the utility industry, it's around how do we give it a free rein, ignore the laws that are passed or not passed. Like you, having been in that space a long time, wanting a clean environment for yourself and your children and grandchildren, right?
Right.
If you just had the ability to wave a wand and suggest kind of the best way to produce electricity, balancing costs to the economy and all the rest of it, is there a mix that you would say 90% nuclear, or how would you look at it that makes the most sense?
Yeah, I love nuclear. I worked in a nuclear plant for 6 months doing a repowering, refueling. But I think from a permitting point of view and a time point of view, it's less than perfect. So I hope that people keep working on those small modular reactors. I hope we stop retiring plants that are perfectly good and can be relicensed, and we just be adult about it and make the upgrades that are needed. But no, natural gas to me is the answer. You know what I mean? You've got this incredible technology of fracking that's already several decades old. Definitely some concerns with the quality of the water that they do to pressurize that, but they're liberating this ridiculous amount of natural gas. It's very much a domestic product. You talk about energy security and the things you and I remember from the 70s sitting on freaking gas lines.
Lines.
Unbelievable. So you got natural gas.
And they look at me like I'm insane.
Yeah.
In New York for a while, you had people switching license plates because if yours ended in an even number, you could go on Wednesdays and Fridays, and ended on craziness. Lines down the street. Yeah.
And we're kind of giving it away by, buying solar and batteries and things that are manufactured in another country. And again, I know the ideal is that it be made here, but that's really not exactly how it's playing out. And I'm a big fan of solar. I've got it on the roof right on this house. I've had it since 2009. I'm an early adopter. So I get the benefits, but it's not an one size fits all, and it's not scalable to 100%. So anyway, with the natural gas, so you get a double. You actually get so many benefits. It's almost ridiculous, right? You first of all, long before any green initiative or anything like that, people have been decarbonizing. They've gone from clear cutting forests to burn wood to just barely keep warm, right? To getting some coal, being able to put a little nugget in the stove and keep much warmer. Now it's dirty. I hate it, especially back then. I'm glad that we kept going. We got to oil, right? So wood and without making this too simple, wood and coal are both carbon. They're just 100% carbon, right? And then you get to oil, you get C3H8. So now you got some hydrogen. Everyone agrees that's clean. So now all of a sudden you've decarbonized just by going to oil by 50% or whatever it is, and then
it's going to be the title of this episode: decarbonize, use oil.
You're still decarbonizing, right? You're just not fixated on getting to that 0%. And then when you go to natural gas, it's basically CH4, right? So you could say that it's C2H8, right? And that compares to oil as C3H8. So it's already 50% cleaner than oil, which was already considerably cleaner than gas. So you're going from coal to gas, and that's that. There's very few power plants that make electricity that burn oil, right? So it's kind of coal or it's gas. Most of them in the Northeast here are already gas. So that's one huge benefit. That's just one benefit. If you just let the market take over, regardless of what anybody in the White House is doing, coal is going to keep losing shares, gas is going to keep gaining shares, and the environment's going to keep getting cleaner like it has done. And that's a great, why we're throwing out something that's been helping us decarbonize is surprising me. And again, the engineers wanted to go to uranium, the nuclear plants, which was zero carbon. And you know who stopped them? The people that were fixated with the fact that there's concerns with nuclear. And I get them. I understand that.
Right.
But, and that just made it, so 30 or 40 years ago, if there was an environmental movement against nuclear power, I can tell you for sure in New York State, we wouldn't be having this conversation about carbon reduction because we have more nuclear plants.
It makes much more sense, right, to move away from carbon. Here's a question for you, because you've only used uranium for reactors, and I think that was largely a byproduct of the Manhattan Project, that we kept building the nuclear arsenal for years after the war. But what's your opinion, if you have one, on thorium, which is a far better nuclear reactor fuel, is used only by the Navy in a few small applications, and its byproducts are largely inert, right? So one of the complaints from the environmentalists, which I share, is the byproducts of uranium fission are nasty for centuries. But thorium, you could probably dump it in the backyard and not care. So what prevented the movement to thorium reactors in the last 50 years? Any ideas?
I actually don't know. I'd just be speculating. And I don't want to waste anybody's time. Yeah, I'm not sure.
No, I'm curious, because it's something where there are lots of thorium kind of people come in mining, and a lot of people in mining of thorium deposits. And it's also a byproduct of some processes. have been insisting for years this is the better way to go. And just on the face of it, they're right. And I've always wondered if it really is just institutional inertia, that we've just created this fleet of uranium-based plants.
Yeah.
And that's what people know how to do. But I don't know. I'm not sure either why not.
I'll at least speculate on the inertia piece. I mean, I'm sure you know the history of it. The timing of that China Syndrome movie coming out was literally a month before 3 Mile Island failed. And that was the worst nuclear accident in the U.S. This was in the early 80s. I forget the exact dates. But that just kind of kiboshed any. And at that point, a few more plants got built. The incredible thing is the country as a whole, the United States, is like 20% nuclear. And that's coming from just 104 plants. I mean,
and
think
France
about
is
it.
like 90% nuclear, and they never had an accident. So it can be done.
It can be done. And even 3 Mile Island, we learned so much from it. There's no proof of any negative effect other than the fear, which, again, I get that. They had to evacuate it. There was terror. And again, you have this movie that was about uranium, so that was really problematic.
Was she in that? Was it Jane Fonda?
I didn't. Yes, she was. Yeah. I'm.
she's the ghost that keeps on giving. God, how can one physically attractive woman do that much damage to a country?
It was just really, really poor timing. And again, I just want to make that, because there's this sense that, like, okay, these people that are advocating for it, they're crazy, but they ultimately get to the right place. And honestly, I don't think a lot of times they get to the right place. And I'd use nuclear as a good example. Right? The hysteria around nuclear that pretty much shut it down, stopped us from kind of completing that full decarbonization. And like you said, France, I think at the moment they're about 78 or 80% nuclear. But yeah, they're killing it. They've standardized all the reactors. They process the fuel, which is a long story I'll spare you of, but that dramatically reduces the low-level waste, which is really the concern. The nuclear plants themselves are not enriched enough to actually explode like the ones in a submarine or something like that. So it becomes treating that low-level waste, and does stay there for thousands of years. So I'm not minimizing the issues with it, but those would be the things we'd be worried about now, as opposed to the carbon. So there's just this sense that we can just keep messing with the model, and it's going to be all right. And the same thing, like I said, the carbon dioxide came down almost 50% in New York State as they moved off of oil to natural gas. And we completely disrupted that when we said, we're going to do reforming the energy vision in New York State. Everybody's going to go solar and batteries, and they're going to cut from the grid. This was like 2014, 2015. And, since we have this latitude, and they'll get, I'm sure there's some people that will get annoyed with me at tying them together, but they were like, and don't worry, that's going to more than take care of when we shut down Indian Point. So let's before we get any benefits, let's just shut up and right up. And that was in 2020, 2021. It's going to be another decade or two before they even just offset that. Forget about getting lower. So, yeah.
I remember the fights around Shoreham, because out on the far Long Island, they were creating Shoreham nuclear power, and that was like 2 years from being commissioned when they finally shut it down. It never came online.
It never came online.
The ratepayers have been paying for that ever since, right? That was like $4 billion of sunk cost.
Yeah,
that everyone on Long Island is still paying for.
And
could Indian Point be restarted, or is it just the way they shut it down is decommissioned?
I mean, ironically, the group, so probably not, but yeah, theoretically it could be done. And, the group that largely protested against it, River Keepers, is now protesting against the decommissioning, and they're slowing it down. So it might end up taking 8 years. So ironically, if it were to be pulled out of the ashes, it would be because they've been delaying the decommissioning of it. And you mentioned Shoreham, that was interesting. That one's on the end of an island, right? That's becoming more and more populated. That was Mario Cuomo that did it, Governor Cuomo's dad. So I got to believe, as a young child, he saw that and felt that was the right. I'm not sure that was the right thing to do. He felt that was the right thing to do. And now he was, he knew his Westchester constituents wanted to take that one out, and he took his opportunity. Yeah. It's unfortunate.
There's a tremendous book to be written on the damage the Cuomo's never ending. We'll touch it. Especially what I find funny is, in the age of information, data flows around everywhere. But
Right.
if you happen to grow up in a certain locale, all politics is local, right? So I came across the Cuomo's. I believe you did. And I always try to be very respectful of things that you learn privately, you don't share publicly. But I've
Yeah.
had my criticisms of our former governor. There's the
Yeah.
second one. A lot. First one I didn't find it so bad.
All I'm saying is the goal was to reduce carbon, and we did the exact reverse. So that's the kind of intellectual honesty I'm asking for. Let's do it. Let's reduce carbon, and let's be ruthless about it. And that ruthlessness means going, hey, did what we do actually work? And the answer is, at least in places like New York State and Germany's another poster child for this, but
they shut down the nuclear reactors after Fukushima, which was a coastal.
That's right. A tsunami wipes out 61,000 people. Right.
Yeah.
And again, there's so much to learn from that. Anyway, it's not the way you would think you'd go.
So you've got a very rational viewpoint, which of course doesn't fit well with today's hysterical political environment, right? I mean, I was like, it's on both sides, right? But our current president is the usual target, right? And I would say that if Donald Trump came up with a program to give pet rabbits to kids with cancer, the leftists start screaming about the danger of leptospirosis being handed off to immunocompromised children.
Right.
So, and so that's just a fact of life. And I don't know. I also don't know if getting rid of him changes anything in terms of the hysterical political climate we've lived in.
No.
Which is arguably augmented by the internet. When the nightly news was on 2 channels from 7 to 8, and that was it, and you could read a newspaper if you were so inclined, I think people would just didn't have enough opportunity to get outraged about anything.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, my news feed is funny. It feeds me things it knows I want to see, but it also feeds me things it knows kind of annoy me because it knows I'll probably click on it. So that's really that's unfortunate.
It is. A very funny movie. I always thought Howard Stern was a bit of a putz for a lot of reasons, and he lived near us on Long Island. He was a real moron, full of himself beyond belief. But anyway, the funny thing in the movie they did about him was when they were he was the first real shock jock, right? The one who really said outrageous things on the air. And when they were reviewing it, they couldn't fire him because he drove advertising to the roof, right? And they were finding out that people who liked what Howard had to say listened to him for an average of 90 minutes. And people who hated what he had to say listened to him for 2 hours.
Right. Exactly.
It's really awful. I'm going to complain to NBC, right? So I don't know how we get away from that, or people just need to grow up, which they won't.
Yeah, that's and that's kind of what feeds that hysteria, because it's like, okay, I don't like big, risky things that I don't know anything about, and certainly you can't get any bigger than climate change, right? And now you've given me a villain that I can point to. It's a fossil fuel developer, and they're a big rich villain, and there couldn't be more dark. And everything else goes out the window. Have our lives improved in the last 150 years? Dramatically, more than doubling of the lifespan, the level of health that we're at, access to different things. And for the whole world too, that's the other thing. We got to remember the world too. When we do these fancy solar and wind only approaches in the first world countries with nothing but money, and we decide that we're going to inflict this on some third world country where they're just trying to keep their kids warm, and it's crazy. So you got to remember that whole thing, right? So there's no perspective, and it's very easy to get that no perspective because we're so comfortable here. We just take it for granted that we can if we just yell and scream about it enough, we're going to get our way. And it's not that easy. And the problem with a big complex system like the utility grid and the utility system is that there's a lot of inertia in it. All the smart things that were done 20, 30, 40 years ago, building redundancy, so in New York City, there's two extra things for everything you need, even on the hottest day in the summer. Most of the other utilities in the country are still one extra, and then everything's tied together. So even if you do something dumb here, you could pick it up here. So it takes decades to undo that. But when you have these policies, and you start getting rid of, again, you start retiring 2,000 megawatts of baseload nuclear power that was carbon free and really important for the grid. It's this word that no one wants to talk about in the renewables industry, which is it was dispatchable. It was reliable. It was not intermittent. And you start doing things in New York State, like you start restricting where you're not even going to let a 1960s vintage oil and gas plant upgrade their permit and change it out and completely get rid of that and put in a brand new combined cycle natural gas plant that's got like 80 to 90% lower NOx, which is what causes the smog, 80 to 90% lower particulate matter, which is what causes the asthma, especially in that. And you're going to get these tremendous benefits. And by the way, it's going to reduce. Now, the old plant was gas. This plant is gas. The other, I told you, the one bang for the buck going from coal to gas had a lot of savings. Now you go from a 30% efficient 1960s vintage plant to a 57%, almost 60% efficient gas-powered plant. So you get another 50% in efficiency. So you do reduce carbon by 50%. But you put it up to the litmus test. Does it take it to zero? No. And so you don't do that. And you keep running that old plant, or you retire that old plant and nothing's replaced it. And that's certainly where we are in New York State. Yeah. And a lot of other places are coming there too. I think PJM announced that they're going to have a potential generation shortage in 2026, as early as 2026. The NISOs initially said 2025, which is the New York Independent, and pushed it off. But so you're adding costs, you're not reducing carbon, and you're making the grid dramatically less reliable because the few things that you are succeeding with renewable stuff, they're not dispatchable. And sure, someday we'll have batteries, and we have some now, and there's some great success stories. But to get to that 100%
batteries, and you got to consider where the materials come from.
Right.
Well, I try to tell my kids, like standing on Atlantic Beach at sunset, I used to tell them, you can see New York, the Manhattan skyline in the distance. It used to be yellow tinged. There used to be smog. In my childhood, I'm not that. Oh, I'm getting old. But like it's clear now.
The oceans. Yep. You got to really turn your nose. You got to really look away from the progress, right? And again, it's easy. We will set you. You were saying Howard Stern. More people listen longer when they didn't want to hear it. It's the same thing with pessimism. Unfortunately, if you wanted to rally people around, I think of this. You kind of call it a religion, and again, we got to be careful because there's a spectrum of really honest people that are looking for really good solutions and are kind of still in that side. And then there's people that, to me, are the same as the guy carrying the sign from 2,000 years ago, wearing a robe and a long white beard and saying the world's going to end.
They're beating themselves with ropes and telling them the world's going to end. Yeah, they scream the loudest.
Yeah.
And part of the problem is that, and this is sort of more political, but it applies here. This guy Michael Mann, who was a professor at I think Pennsylvania or something, and he's been one of the craziest, screaming, yelling, and then they found all those emails between him and other researchers, basically telling him to lie because we don't ever want to present a balanced picture of the data to the public because they're too stupid and they're not going to go along with our messianic approach to net zero, right? And I've always been a strong believer in absolute free speech, even if I hate what you have to say, right? Because the moment you quash speech, you make someone a martyr to their cause. The moment you silence someone, whoever agreed with them is now fully on board because there's no more conspiracy that you're being silenced. You're being silenced.
Right.
It must be right? So, but he won this crazy lawsuit against this guy Mark Stein, who was a journalist or whatever, and eventually that was just overturned because it turned out that it was all insane. I had a marvelous interaction with this guy Michael Mann because there's this crazy woman in Florida. I'm blanking on her last name, Rebecca something. And during the COVID insanity, she created this fantasy that her job was very boring. It's fine, but she took data handed to her and then put it into pretty graphs and put it on the Florida health website, right? She manufactured this tale that she knew the truth about COVID, and the governor and everyone else conspired against her. Crazy woman, like just crazy, nuts. But as a mark of how insane this whole thing has gotten, you know, the peak Wuhan hysterics, as I call them, because I'm not worried about being irritating people. I do it daily. And others are often aligned with the climate hysterics. They seem to be the same bunch. And Chris Cuomo, before he got booted off CNN, had the lunatic on as a guest, right? Because this fit the Democrats' theory that Republicans are crazy people that want everyone to die, right? It was debunked. Like all of her superiors, like she's a lunatic. None of this happened. Doesn't matter. She had a great story to tell to a Democrat establishment who hated Ron DeSantis, as they called him. Right. So Cuomo airs her insanity for the world, so she gets a lot of fame. Then she runs for Congress. Last cycle, Michael Mann, and she had a list of people that endorsed her, including this guy, Michael Mann.
Oh my God!
Come back to him. So I reached out to him for comment. Right, I tried to be as anodyne as I could, hoping to actually engage him before he found out who I was.
Yeah,
but no way, blocked, ignored. But that sort of craziness, again, wherever it comes from, that inability to look at data, because unless we change our system so that politicians are rewarded for doing objectively correct things, we're just going to keep getting more of this.
Yeah.
That's part of what I've always been agitating for, how we fix the budgetary and political process, because incentives matter. And the only reason people spend $1 billion on getting elected president is because there's a reward at the end. Yeah. If there were no goodies to give out, no one would spend money on an election campaign. And I don't know how we get to that, especially when it comes to something that people think is existential, right? But you got folks who are working on it who look at it and say, well, reasonably enough, we can do these things, but we're not doing those things. We'd rather just scream and yell some more.
Yeah. No, I think that's a larger problem, and it goes across the board. I like to be fair about it, but one, you've got, advocacy is super important, right? But sometimes when you get elected leaders whose only, and I'm probably going to get myself in trouble here, but whose only skill set is advocating and just saying that's bad and I have a better future. Unfortunately, when they get into position, they're not at all worried about understanding anything, because their skill set was to just keep beating up what was traditional. Unfortunately, you see a confluence of that in a couple of the places that are doing this stuff. And again, there's almost this immature, like, hey, there's something wrong. I can tie, it's like cars, you know what I mean? Like I can tie 35,000 deaths in the US to cars every year. That's concerning, right? So cars are all, and then just painting it. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting there on the cars. But that's kind of where we are with the fossil fuel industry. Like if I can find one thing that's wrong with it, that's it. Then it should go. And unfortunately, there's a whole set of cheerleaders to doing that. And then the other thing is, it's a very easy story to tell the solar or wind, right? Hey, free energy from the sun. Done. Mic drop. Boom. You've sat here and listened to me for 35 minutes. First of all, you're much more gracious than any voter. If I was trying to convince a whole set of people or politicians to do this, they're not going to give me 30 minutes. And my story is not free energy from the sun. Done. I've got to tell a story about redundancy and, about you need a portfolio of things. You got to have multiple sources of generation. You got to have multiple sources of transmission. There's energy security. There's reliability. I do want to give you a specific example, like the difference between dispatchability and intermittency, which is what the utility engineers like myself worried about all those years, is, I can get free water anytime it rains. I can go out there with a bucket and I can get free water. I'm still paying a water and sewage thing every single month, because there's value to having it when I want it. There's value to me not having to go out there and store it. And water is really easy to store. Electricity is not easy to freaking store. You got to make electricity. The moment you need it, you got to use it. You literally got to use it. Like it would literally the equivalent would be, it would have to rain every time you were thirsty and you just sit there and open your mouth. And obviously that's not going to work.
Rain in just this spot.
That's right. So So to add to the easiness of that story, so you're just saying the sun is free, right? Forget about all the cost it costs you to put it in there, and then ignore the fact that you need batteries, because if you put in 100 megawatt solar plant, this is what gets frustrating. And again, you can see even this explanation is going to take way longer than the mic drop one, right?
Exactly.
Even if you put in 100 megawatts of solar, even in Arizona, it still gets dark at night in Arizona. You know what I mean? It may never rain. Let's say it never rains. It still gets dark. So that thing is only good like 20% of the time. So if you put in 100 megawatts, you're getting an average of 20 megawatts. If you put in a gas combined cycle plant, it's got to come off for maintenance, sure. You got to occasionally cycle it up. But that thing's good like for 90% of the time. Night, day, whatever. So 100 megawatts is the same as 90 megawatts. That's really valuable. So all of a sudden, and this is what the press is showing. They're saying, oh, we've got more solar now than we have any other resource. Well, that's because you're talking about capacity. When you take it down to energy, it's dramatically less. In this case, it's almost 1/5, right? Even though they're the same capacity rate. So that never gets through. Nobody really wants to hear that story. And unfortunately, like I said, there's enough inertia in the system that you can mess it up. And then at some point you do fall off a cliff. And I got to say, we're getting close to this. I mean, California's had rolling blackouts on and off for the last 4 years. They're in a much more temperate climate, so they can tolerate it.
Lots of oil. The great irony. Lots of oil and natural gas to California. They did this to themselves. There are two things I want to add. One on the water example, right? In Australia, where they are so much crazier big government than we even California, right? They took it to such an extreme that a guy living in a suburb of Sydney, he had maybe 3 or 4 acres, but he had a water catchment system off his roofs. And they funneled into his big, expandable bladder container that he used for his water, right? He then didn't need to be on the municipal water, so he canceled his contract. It took the government thought this was so important, they went after him for 3 years of court cases that demanded he pay them a tax on the water he collected that fell, because he was otherwise depriving it from the reservoir that would go to other people. That insanity, that status mentality, and then on the electricity side, of course, she's a lunatic for a range of ways, but serial failure about Stacey Abrams, a politician in Georgia who's lost everything she's ever run for, but the Democrats managed to give her $2 billion on the way out the door for her retrofitting houses. And I watched her. It was CNBC. It wasn't as bad as MSNBC. And she's being interviewed by this guy who's fawning over her. And the gist of it was, she says, and I believe this, our studies showed that when we retrofitted old stoves, whatever, in people's homes, we cut their electricity bill by 15%. You completely believe that, right? But neither she nor the interviewer says, and he says, and that's really great because it's free because the government paid for it, right? Nowhere in that calculation was a real-world estimate of how much capital investment went into saving 15%.
Right.
And it cost 90% more, right? None of that. So the encouragement, the willingness of politicians to either be thoroughly ignorant of economic reality, which I fully believe, or if they are aware of it, shoving it down out of view as quickly as possible. And there was no one in that little dialogue, because he's an idiot. He's a journalist on CNBC who was there to promote Democrats, right? But he actually said it. That, of course, that's free because the government paid for it.
Right.
Wow. And we wonder why we're $35 trillion in debt.
No, it's frustrating. And I'm going to give you a bunch. I feel like I've already given some solutions along the way, but I'll certainly outline a lot of solutions. So your listener don't feel like, this guy's
here. What can they take away from this to be able to speak intelligently to their representatives, saying, "You're full of it. Here's some ideas that we can look up." That's to the extent they tune in. That's why people listen to this.
Yeah, I think people got to just insist on what were the results, because again, just to spend one more second on why it's easy to keep doing this, So again, politicians not going to sit there and listen to a guy like me explain all these other things when they got this other nice little candy for the brain explanation, right? And then think about this. They can make this lofty goal, and they can make it so far away that it's when they're long out of office. In 2035, we're going to have no more, right? So they win either way. And there is a certain sense, and I'm sure there's some purpose. I hope there's some purpose in it and some ideology into it. But there's also this narcissism, like, if it fails, I'm going to say it failed because they didn't listen to me. If it succeeds, I'm going to say it succeeded because of me. If I screw up the system, I'm going to say, see, I told you the system was bad, even though I'm the one that screwed it up. So again, and we saw this in New York State with the Reforming the Energy Vision. In 2014, my God, it's going to be solar, rooftop solar, and batteries in your garage, and people are going to cut from the grid, and we're going to have this transactive market. And we chased that shiny bauble for about 5 years. And then they came out with the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act. And that said the exact inverse, without saying we were completely wrong, that said, oh my God, here's what we're going to do. Large scale offshore winds. We're not going to cut from the grid. No. We need the grid even more than we did before. So now we got to do nothing but build transmission into things that we've just neglected to do for 5 or 6 years while we chase the transactive market and everybody leaving the grid. And that was 2019. We're going to do offshore wind, blah, 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 blah. Everything's going to go through the T&D system. And you know what? Even though we can't get all of the renewables to meet the electric needs, we're going to add heating to it, which is going to increase the amount of, we're going to get everybody off gas and oil heat. So that's still something they're trying to do. And oh, by the way, obviously electric vehicles. So you've now taken, this was how much electricity was being produced before. When you add those things and they finally come to fruition, it's going to be literally three times the amount. So it's talk about chasing your tail. And we're seeing that right now, right? You see the offshore wind was failing long before Trump came in office. They're going to blame that on him.
Started rocking up on every shore. Well, these are not the whale carcasses you're looking for.
Yeah. Well, now because it's actually getting built, now you got that same argument. Like, I can find something imperfect with this. Like, I'm not necessarily against offshore wind, but now you talk about live by the sword and die by the sword, right? Well, now we found one. There's 8 whales, and we don't know if they were hit by ships or what, or whatever. But now that's a little imperfection, and now we're going to kibosh you. So those are the challenges. So anytime you actually did get a chance to have an earnest conversation with your politician, or we're going to send a letter, you say, hey, I want to see actual reductions and what works. And that's natural gas. So again, one, just keep doing the natural gas, keep fracking it, do it as clean as possible. If you want to focus your regulations, focus them there. And to the extent that you get people off coal, you get a 50% benefit. And to the extent that you convert an old plant to a new plant, you get a 50% benefit. In aggregate, if you put in a combined cycle plant like they're proposing doing in one of the, I forget which state that just came out last week, you're getting upwards of 60% of emission reduction, because you're both getting off coal and you're going from 33% efficient coal driven electricity to 56%. So that's number one. Do that, do it cleanly. The other thing is there's all these methane emissions. Like, that's a very legitimate thing. When you're piping the gas to different places, if you're not tightening up valves, if you're not watching what you're doing, if you're flaring the gas, they do that a lot where they're drilling for oil, and the natural gas they get is, so they flare it up. Focus on that. And you've got now satellites that can track this methane. So this is low hanging fruit, Chris. They estimate that in a year or two, you could reduce these methane emissions by like 30% Boom, right off the bat. Not glamorous. It's not going to get any politician elected, but that's another thing. The nuclear is still part of the solution. Don't retire. Do not retire the ones that you have. Make them safe. The nuclear industry has an amazing record. It really does. It's the safest, even compared to solar and wind. I know people don't want to hear that, but just people installing solar panels on roof. Enough of them fell off the roof just because that's a normal construction thing and didn't have the right harnesses or whatever. It's a small amount of people, but it's still more people than have died. Yeah. So again, natural gas, get to combined cycle plants. Those are actually two things, and they're two big ones. manage the methane, manage the whole upstream of how you're extracting the methane, how you're delivering it, and where you're using it. And you've got satellites that can do this. Again, I don't love regulation, but that's what you regulate. That's what you focus on.
Yeah. I'm going to give you a great example of regulation gone awry in the fracking space. We've done a lot of work in that area. And we worked on a project in Louisiana as bankers to kind of come up with a financial financing structure for these guys. They're building out this basically multi-billion-dollar cooperative water management system for frackers, right? So this is where people need to either get more engaged, demand accountability of their representatives, to demand that they solve real problems, not rainbows. And here's a good example. So no one wants polluted water to dump into wetlands and waterways. You can't find anyone who's like, it's a great idea, right? No one wants that. So they created a law saying you got to now, any new systems, water system for fracking, have to have a capture system to then filter the water, or if it's perpetually dirty, find a way to channel it to somewhere they can be put into an isolated settling pond, much like other mining. Okay, that's fine. But the stupidity was, as in all these legislations where companies already have existing employees, prior processes and structures were grandfathered in. So you're not going to be penalized for what happened under the old system.
Right.
But if you actually make the steps to be a better environmental steward, and there's a leak in that system, you're charged $1 million a day for a leak. So now, up until that point, the industry's like, sure, we'd be happy to. We live here too. I don't need to, get antimony and gallium in my fish. Yeah, I'm happy to. So, but that was a great example of they jammed through legislation that had the exact opposite incentive system, because they kept using literally water trucks, trucked to a location, and then used as fracking water. And then they, to the best they could, they recaptured it. But there was no penalty if it just flowed right into the groundwater. Whereas if you tried to create a capture system and there was a leak, suddenly you had multi-million-dollar penalties. And I when I'm involved in this stuff with government, working on the financial side of things for companies, my brain just hurts. Like there's a predictable outcome to that, which is no one's going to build a water capture system.
Right. Yep.
So how do you get that across? Same as your idea of the 60s oil plant. We can retrofit it. Nope, it's not perfect. Okay, we'll keep burning oil. Like, I don't know how.
Yeah.
Or if we can get to rational change.
Yeah, I don't know either. I mean, the carbon, I guess we'd be remiss if we don't bring it up. I suspect both of us don't love it, but, the carbon tax would be the goal of that, right? Because that would then recognize that you've taken this plant and you've improved it, so you're avoiding that kind of carbon tax. But my concern, having been in the industry, is it's just this insatiable appetite for, to just keep turning the screws to stuff and not to acknowledge progress, and it's not quite the same perverse, like what you're describing is literally a perverse disincentive to do the right thing. But it's the same basic premise. You don't want to punish people for doing the right thing. You don't want to punish people for using energy. One of the points that I make when I teach this class to the kids in Colombia is, your ancestors were not idiots. They were not bad people. Some of them may have been bad people. I mean, humanity and the human condition is one of tragedy. It's been major suffering, from the beginning of time, and the discoveries we've made in medicine and energy and all this stuff, and energy kind of fuels all of them, have just dramatically improved a lot of people's lives. So I try to just make that point to them, just have that perspective. If you disagree with me, you disagree with me, but I don't think anyone would trade places with their grandparent 100 years ago. So I just don't know where you go with that. And then the next question is, how are you going to actually do, if you really believe that it's criminal to use fossil fuels? I believe it's criminal to bad, or at least a very bad idea to do cocaine. So I don't do cocaine. I don't do, but so how you use it and just decide that that's amazing to me. And then the third thing is, I asked them, I said, think of the people in the 2/3 of the people that don't have access to energy like we did, that don't have access to clean, how are they going to get it? How do you expect them to get there before we get there. We can't get to this. This idea that they're just going to leapfrog it is kind of crazy. And that it's hard to move power on a bulk level. People don't realize that. They think everything conforms to Moore's law. Man, I don't want to keep rambling on, but the cell phone was a pretty cool thing, right? Because the first world countries benefited from it, but then you were able to kind of leapfrog ahead of it in the third world nations. You were able to build cell phones.
Yeah, telecommunications, rather than installing massive fixed infrastructure, Africa is the greatest. They went right to cellular. Brilliant.
Yeah, but the energy to run this, right? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's funny because, again, that's social conditions. Part of why, because I lived and worked in Southern Africa for years, and the experience of telecoms building out traditional fixed infrastructure was, sadly, if you're running wires and you're running massive cables and all that through impoverished areas, the locals very often would scavenge. So they would tear down the towers, they'd sell the copper. So first off, you can't protect the infrastructure, but they realized I could literally build a razor wire wall around a cell tower and pay for 2 guards there 24/7.
Yep.
And I can then have telecommunications. So it was a mixture of practicality, security, and it happens, I'm sure, but when was the last time someone looted a hospital or a telecom facility in New York for the copper wire? Like, maybe not in a long time, but for a lot of practical reasons, they went right to cellular, which has been brilliant and has been one of the best benefits ever of that information exchange, and even building tools for even mostly illiterate farmers now can literally buy and sell their crops pictographically on phones. It's brilliant stuff.
It's brilliant. So
there is advancement, but the human nature thing is always tough. And the weird thing that's happened in America, which I find fascinating, is you get to this level of prosperity and people are just grumpy and unhappy instead of insanely grateful. Like, everyone. People on welfare in New York live better, safer, cleaner, healthier lives than medieval kings and queens did. Right?
Yep.
And when it comes to punting the can down the road for politicians, Thomas Jefferson wanted to include either in the Constitution or as the first set of amendments that at the time, actuarially, like, so if you were a federal politician, whatever that meant at that time, right? You were in Congress. Your life expectancy was something like 8 years from now.
Right.
He wanted to put in something saying that the government couldn't borrow anything with a longer duration than 8 years because you should live with the consequences of your actions.
Nice.
That's
Brilliant.
Right? He nailed it. That if you don't have to live, 100-year bond, great idea, sure, shit. Oh, and the big payoff, great, let's borrow that. And that's effectively what we've done.
That's what we've done. You've got politicians at a very local level promising that 100 years from now, they're going to make an impact on the temperature of the globe or something like that from some action that they do that they only control like this much. Now, there's value in leadership and things like that, but it's a fundamental hubris to completely skip over everything that's working and everything that's got you on this downward path and say, no, I know better because I'm going to turn the path there despite overwhelming evidence. And just to make the point with the cell phone, as amazing as that was, the amount of energy you need, you can send signals wirelessly. Everybody agrees with that. Yep. I mean, I asked the class, are any of you even using induction chargers? And most of them don't, and that's just where you can put it right there and you can wirelessly charge. But any kind of analogy for the cell phone tower breaks down with electricity. You're moving a ridiculous amount of power. It's hard. Again, the battery works at this level. This is like watts. We're talking about terawatts and ridiculous nanowatts, the numbers that you remember from, freaking high school chemistry. So it's not replicable. So Moore's law does not apply to everything. As cool as electric vehicles are, you're going to be driving them on the same roads Henry Ford was driving his Model T Ford on, right? The water, same thing. You're going to get it through the same pipes. Natural gas and electricity, it's not going to and we've proven it. Like, I'm not just saying this and wishing it. we've proven it. Like I said, New York State went all in 2014 trying to do this concept of wireless electricity, which was going to be just rooftop solar and storage. So it's important to understand that and keep that in context. But that's another important message. Everything does not succumb to Moore's law. And supply chain was another great example. You were talking about COVID. Supply chain it's great that you can order it on Amazon. It's amazing that you can, but at some point it's got to get here, and somebody's actually got to be making that paper towel or toilet paper, whatever we were going crazy for at the moment. At some point, somebody's actually got to be manufacturing. There is no virtual, commodities like that. Let me just leave it at that. Not be gross.
There's no Star Trek replicator yet. And
not yet.
As the last point, for those folks who should know this and don't, and they've got this nagging sensation they should know, what is Moore's law?
Right. Oh, so Moore's law is the fact that the chip is right. So it came around with the computers in the 1960s, and Moore was some computer smart guy that recognized that the price of the chips and the power of the chips kept halving every 18 months or something like that. I'm sure I'm butchering the crap out of this, but it was just this exponential. What's that?
He's one of the founders of Intel.
Yes, he was one of the founders of Intel. Awesome. So hopefully I got that right.
You're going to get this phenomenal increase in computing power for less and less energy, which is very helpful.
It's super helpful, but it doesn't mean you can apply it to everything. You got to realize where it's going to break down, and it's going to break down with roadways. It's going to break down with the actual commodities, the food that you eat, the paper towels that you want to use, and the electricity you want. You got to kind of recognize that. Now you can use it to make things better and to optimize stuff, but fundamentally, you've got to generate the power somewhere, and you've got to transmit and deliver the power somewhere. And
it's got to be. I will end with this, because this is one of those, and this is a phenomenal conversation. I hope people pay attention, because the major. One of the major headaches. I'm not a big fan of forcing testing on people before voting, because we've got a long bad history of that in this country. Right? I don't want the citizenry to have to pass a test to vote, but I would like people in Congress to have to pass tests before they vote on legislation. That I think is fair, right? That's fair. We're not blocking voting access. We are, however, controlling you being a moron of one of 435 who's voting on crap you don't understand. Right? If you can't define standard deviation, you're not allowed to vote on any of this. Right? There was this. Oh God, straight out of my head. Oh, it's killing me. Too bad. It was a good one, but it was generally about that idea that the vast majority of people who sadly get to vote on these policies don't understand them at all. I mean, I remember that during the Dodd-Frank Act, which impacted my industry badly, and I helped provide testimony to folks before that. And one of the congressmen, there were 435 congressional representatives, and he came from Wall Street. He was in Connecticut, Democrat. We still get along. He's like, there are 4 people who understand what a derivative is, right? They're all voting on it, and they all think it's awful. And I challenged people back then, when they were creating Dodd-Frank, this stupid, damaging law. And if you could find me a journalist who could report a story and just say the word derivative, I'd give you $10, because they all said exotic derivatives. They couldn't just say derivative.
Right. They had to make it sound like
every single journalist is a liberal arts major who doesn't understand, who was terrified by calculus that they had to take in high school and tried not to, right? And not a single article. Now you've got Google search, you get data science on articles, right? None of them could just say derivative. It was always exotic derivative, right? This horrifying, terrifying thing.
Right.
And I got a discussion with a politician during that time period, a representative in New York, at actually a NYSERDA meeting, ironically. I said, tell you what, could I, next week I'm going to be up in Westchester, and I know that you've got a couple extra cars. Do you mind if I borrow one? Just because I'll get off the train station, I got to go to lunch, and would that be okay? Because I'm finding it hard to rent a car. Right? And I did that for a purpose. He looked at me strangely and said, yeah, sure, that'd be fine. I said, you just entered into an exotic forward swap. That should be regulated. We should regulate that. You agree to do something for me in the future with an uncertain payoff, an uncertain risk, and you haven't checked whether I've got insurance. Like you just entered into an exotic derivative. Over the counter, by the way. It's not on an exchange. He didn't like that.
No, I bet not.
But I mean, it's this. It's what this podcast is about. Is helping people get a grip on what politicians they maintain their power by two things simultaneously. And if you disagree, tell me. But you've been kind of in this space, right? They make what they do. They make government policy at the same time extremely boring and wildly complicated, right? So you already have a disincentive to look into it because it's a snooze fest where they tell you it is, even though it affects your life. And then when you do look into it, they make it like a massive Rube Goldberg machine. So it's almost impenetrably difficult to understand, which dissuades the majority of people from bothering. And that's why they get to keep staying in power and doing whatever they want, and we all get screwed.
Right. There's an institutional inertia to it, unfortunately. Yeah. No. And again, just, it's tough, but people educating themselves more would be helpful. The papers would be helpful too if they, I read about some of these things. I don't even want to give an example, but I will give an example. You're reading about the wildfires. I can never, even in the journals I think are high up that just show me a map and show me what's on fire. No, I just see the most sympathetic picture of somebody, and I get that. But how do you understand? And that's fine. It's important to have the human story, but everybody can't have the human story. Somebody's got to have the story of how big is this? What are the scientific drivers of this? And how do we solve that? So
and let's have an informational map of where the dry reservoirs are that were emptied out by a fire department chief who didn't care about water retention, right? So that would be an infographic too, but we don't get that one,
right?
But anyway,
right. Even
your final parting words. What would you say to folks who, in general, like a cleaner environment, want a prosperous country, want to balance all those things?
Yeah.
How do they get a basic layman's grip on sort of the topics you raised? That in fact we are moving in a better direction. Determine what your goals are. Is it lower carbon? Is it cheaper electricity? Is that it? Like pick a target for what you care about, and then you can make sure to at least tell your Congress people that.
Yeah, I think it's don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, to use that, that old expression. You know what I mean? Like, because you can find a single flaw, it doesn't mean it's all bad. So first sit there and just decide your own perspective. I appreciate that you may hear everything I say and disagree with it, but at least sit there. Has humanity done better with this? And are we going to be better off, no matter what you believe about how the climate is going to change? Are we going to be better off with the changing climate if we've got a rock solid grid that runs well, or one that's intermittent and we have rolling blackouts and things like that where we see these different things? So we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and then establish your own perspective, but don't take any solutions off the table either. Let's keep doing what made sense, and switching to natural gas made a lot of sense. Let's keep doing that. Let's keep exploring new things, which includes solar, wind. Hydro's, doing great, and hydro's got some issues with it too. It's not a favorite of the environmentalists, but so you got all of the above. It should be an all of the above solution, and it should be weighted for the one that's dramatically helped you. I'm sorry, but it should be. Gas is already there. It's already low cost. It's a very domestic product. We're kicking butt. Okay, you get the point. And then R&D is always a key part. It's always been a key part. That's kind of, everybody likes that, right? But that's where you're going to get the nuclear. That's where you're going to get these satellites focusing on the methane emissions. That's where you're going to, those are easy things to fix. Those are practically just a guy walking around or a gal walking around and tightening up packing valves on some of these big valves. I'm oversimplifying it, but these are things you can do tomorrow, in the next 6 months, and the next year. So there's tremendous amount of solutions. And then the other piece, and then the final piece is, and if you do all of those things, you're going to start mitigating climate change now. You're not going to eliminate it under any scenario. And you're going to make a robust grid that you can adapt to it. And the people that aren't in as good position to you as you are in other parts of the world are also going to be able to enjoy some of the things that we have and be much more adaptable to any climate change that does occur if they have, good clean energy and from these different sources. So all of the above. Awesome.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I think we're both going to take off to go surfing now. So,
That sounds great.
thanks a lot.
Take care, Chris. Good talking to you.